Hello, my name is Caroline Stokes. I'm the CEO and founder of Forward. Today, all of September and October, I am bringing together the brilliant brains that are helping us to evolve in our new world. I am especially delighted today to be introducing Dr. Alfred Hermida. He is the director and professor at University of British Columbia's School of Journalism, Writing and Media. Alf is a very special individual because he was the founding news editor of the BBC News website in 1997 when editorial online first started. He is also the winner of the National Business Book Award in 2015 for Tell Everyone Why We Share and Why It Matters. He is also co-founder of The Conversation Canada in 2017. So it's absolutely wonderful to have you here, Alf. Thank you very much for making time.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So I'm going to ask you my favorite question during COVID times, which is, we're having a tough time. The media in particular is probably having its most important day right now. So I'm very curious, as you are the director and professor at University of British Columbia School of Journalism, Writing and Media. What are you stoked about in our new world?
Well, clearly the media's role has always been important, but at a time of crisis like this, of a time of uncertainty, in a very fast evolving situation with the pandemic and the social, cultural, economic impacts, the media's role is ever more important. Yeah. At the same time, what you're seeing is the stresses on the media. And now this is not new. This is a story of the last 50 years, the decline of traditional media, starting with television in the 60s, all through the internet, etc. So this is a long story of decline. But what we've seen with the pandemic is a shock to the system, a shock where in Canada, you've had about 2,000 media workers who've been laid off, either permanently or temporarily, 50 news outlets, more than 50 who've been closed down. In the US, 36,000 media workers laid off, furloughed. So this stress and shock to the system. But it's also a wake-up call. And that's, I think, where I would see the other side of the coin here, is that, yes, this is a tremendous strain on the media, on journalists, on people working there who rely on this for their livelihoods. But it's also a wake-up call for us to realize that the crisis we're in is not technological, it's not economic, it's societal and cultural. It's a shift in journalism and its purpose and who it serves. And maybe we needed this shock as a wake-up call to think in terms of what do we need to do to be more relevant to people today when they need us more than ever.
It's very interesting you said all of that. Number one, I had no idea, and I feel quite embarrassed that I did not know this, that so many people had been laid off in what I see as a critical information and news is so critical right now.
And it's partly the way sort of, especially legacy media, institutional media has been run. You know, there's been a real lack of adapting to the digital landscape. It's been very much a way of, we've been doing this for decades, we've been doing this for the last 100 years, let's just tweak it and make it work in the digital world, as opposed to realizing the digital world is not the analog world. It is very, very different. Not just because of the rise of players like Google and Facebook, but also simply in the way people get their information. You know, this idea that you need an evening newscast to tell you what's going on in the world seems really anachronistic when we have news at our fingertips all the time. If anything, we have too much information and we need more filters to help us make sense of it. But it's this idea of how do you build a long-term sustainable digital strategy that reflects the reality of your audience, of the public you are serving, rather than reflecting the ways that have worked in the past. And we all know it's human habit. You know, we try something. If something has worked for us in the past, we tend to keep on doing it. And, you know, we get this cognitive dissonance when we try something, it doesn't work. We don't think it's because we're wrong. We think it's, something else was wrong. And if I just try again, it will work. So there's lots of things that come into us. And I think with the COVID-19 pandemic, it really has been that shock to the system that's saying, well, maybe our cognitive dissonance in journalism is something we need to recognize and think, how do we actually change? How do we actually change our mindset to be more digital and more aware of living in a digitally connected world?
Hmm. Fascinating. So, if I'm understanding you correctly, the people, the unfortunate layoff scenario is because of print and broadcast, and and they just didn't move fast enough. Is that the challenge?
It's partly moving fast enough, but the other side is understanding where they're moving to. So I'll give you the example of the Toronto Star in Canada, Canada's best-selling print newspaper.
Mm.
And its digital strategy a few years ago was to create a tablet edition. And that was it. That was the answer. Like, we'll create a tablet edition of the newspaper. They didn't question what was the motivation behind it, what was the rationale. The fact that Rupert Murdoch had tried this in the States with the Daily and had failed. The fact that actually people get their information from a variety of different news sources throughout the day. But they invested tens of millions of dollars into this project.
Wow.
And 2 years later, closed it down because it was getting tens of thousands of readers a week. So it's kind of, they were thinking, how can we replicate the newspaper experience online rather than asking the question, what do our audience need from us? So it's not just about moving quickly enough, but also about having the right question. And I think we always tend to go to the answer. Like, there's a crisis, there's something happening, here's the answer, here's the solution. As opposed to thinking, well, what is the question I need to ask to get to the right answer? And if you never ask the question, you're never going to get to the right answer. And I would say that really has been the challenge in journalism. You see it in other industries, but really in established media, where journalists had decades of experience, decades of socialization into certain ways of thinking and doing. And so therefore they just want to do the same thing because it's worked in the past.
Fascinating. So that leads me to asking you quite an unusual question, I think, but you've just helped me come up with it, which is, what more beautiful question can individuals and organizations be asking at this time? And, thinking about audiences, thinking about the media, thinking about organizations as a whole, because I think there's a lot of similarities in how the media have operated, and if they haven't adapted to the modern world, I hate calling it the modern world, let's say the digital stroke COVID era, if they haven't adapted and they're not adapting fast enough, there's going to be a fallout. So the question again, just because I'm clarifying it as I speak, I don't have somebody in my ear giving me questions. What beautiful question could people be asking themselves, individuals, media and organizations, to evolve in this new era?
I think it's a very simple one. It's basically, what don't I know? What don't I know? What don't I know about my audience? What don't I know about my digital services? What don't I know about my newsroom? What don't I know about my culture in my newsroom? What don't I know about the economics of the business? What don't I know about how Google operates? What don't I know about algorithms? What don't I know about how Facebook manipulates the feeds of people? What don't I know about how political parties are trying to influence these algorithms? What don't I know? As opposed to saying, we have a crisis, the newspaper isn't selling, I know, people are online, we should create a digital newspaper, and that's the answer. Or, in case of CBC's case, they have their flagship national evening newscast, and instead of saying, well, does an evening newscast, a 1 hour evening newscast, that's a recap of the day's news, is it still fit for purpose? The question, they basically said, how can we adapt this for a digital world? As opposed to saying, well, what is the point of this? What do I know about my audience and what they need? And I think these are the questions. What do I need to know about a whole range of things? Because without that kind of knowledge, you can't build a clear strategy. If you don't have the right questions, you'll get the wrong answers. And this has in research, you come up with a research question, and if you're already decided the answer, then that's not the way you work. You don't start with the answer, then work back to, well, this is the question I had.
You said sometimes I do that.
I think we all have a tendency to come up with a solution. But I think in journalism, what's happened is largely because you have very experienced, talented journalists, but they came up through a very, an analog system of journalism. And the world of journalism now is so completely different, let alone the fact that you have a system of journalism that is largely been white, male, and very patriarchal. And that whiteness, that maleness in newsrooms has gone unquestioned until now. We've seen this with the rise of Black Lives Matter, Me Too movements that are questioning who is journalism for and what are the harms that journalism is causing by not accurately representing the diversity of the communities it seeks to serve.
Yes, so that is what don't I know about my audience, and that is going to be really powerful, because if you don't know, then you're just going to keep doing what you're doing.
Yeah, and if you don't know that Black communities feel underrepresented, that Indigenous communities feel marginalized, that you're not accurately representing their point of view, that you're talking to the wrong people to get voices in those communities, then of course your journalism is going to be flawed. Now, this is not to say there's not great journalism happening, because there is, and there are places that are seeking to sort of serve these audiences and provide digital services that are relevant. But it's this overarching way of thinking in journalism, cultural change. And as we all know, culture is incredibly hard to change, but everything stems from that. And I think this goes back to where we started when we think about like the crisis in journalism. If you define the crisis as purely economical, if you define the crisis as Google and Facebook are taking our advertising, then you're never going to solve the crisis, because the crisis isn't just economic. It's social, it's cultural, it's societal. And that's where you come to, what don't I know about my crisis? And my crisis is that the way I've been doing things doesn't work anymore quite in this way I think it should. The audiences I'm serving, I'm not really serving. I'm not really representing the diversity of audiences. Am I presenting a picture of modern Canada as it is today, or the US, with a diversity of peoples, languages, experiences, and perspectives?
So well said. It's really wonderful to hear the way you blend both societal, and yes, it's cultural, and yes, it is economic, and the whole world is changing in front of our eyes at a tremendous pace, or not changing. We're now seeing things in a different way. We're now having to challenge our own beliefs, and you asking those questions is to enable people to get away from just wanting to blame other forces, versus, okay, well, how can we adapt? How can we understand more so we can pivot? So many people hate that phrase, but pivot and really try and create something of value to an audience that want to actually listen. They want to be spoken to. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, well, let me pick you up on the word pivot, because
okay.
With my colleague Marilyn Young at UBC and myself, we're running a big media innovation project, and we've just written a chapter looking at this idea of the media industry pivoting, and basically take issue with that, because it's like a pivot to nowhere. And I think that's part of the challenge, because you look at back in journalism, and what you've seen happening is trying to grab onto the latest shiny thing as the solution to the problem in journalism. Right. So if we think back 10 years ago, it was, citizen journalism, user-generated content, participatory journalism will involve the audience. That will solve our crisis. No, it didn't. A few years ago, it was video, because Facebook said the future is video. So suddenly newsrooms invest in video, which is expensive and hard to do well. And so other parts of the newsroom are then not resourced as well, whereas most people still get their news via text, be it on a small screen or a large screen. And so this pivoting means you don't have a long-term sustainable strategy that is clearly aligned with your editorial and business goals. You're basically chasing the next pivot. And so in this chapter with Marilyn Young, we basically argue the media has been pivoting to nowhere. This never-ending pivot just is the wrong answer to the wrong question.
Following trends again. Got it.
You don't want to ignore trends, but you have to understand, how do we fit into that trend? And what is our long-term sustainable goal, both editorially and from a business perspective? And maybe video doesn't fit into that. And Google says the future is video. You go, well, our future is not Facebook and video. But this is like questioning these things, questioning the trends, and really having a very clear long-term goal. But of course, being flexible in that long-term goal. having an overarching vision and mission of where you see yourself as a newsroom in this digital ecosystem, rather than just following the latest trend and pivoting to it, and then realizing, oh, yep, that didn't really work, didn't work for us because we don't know how to do that. If you imagine print newsrooms trying to do video. Video is hard. I spent years working in television at the BBC. Doing good video is hard. Audiences won't accept bad video. We're all used to a certain quality now. So don't just chase the latest trend, but analyze that trend. Question, what is it about that trend? How does that relate to our audiences, where we see ourselves, and how can we build a sustainable strategy? And that's the other side of it, a sustainable strategy, rather than chasing, okay, we have funding for 3 years. That's great. We'll do things for 3 years. And then at the end of 3 years, realizing, oh, we didn't actually plan for the next 3 years. And you see this in the history of and studies of journalism startups. They get initial funding, and in the first few years, you're trying to establish yourself. But at the same time, you're building the plane, but you also need to build the infrastructure for the plane to have places to land. And you're so busy building the plane, you've forgotten about the infrastructure to allow you to continue flying. You need to land and refuel somewhere.
Yes. You need some idea, and you need the right people to support you to make all of that happen. So that's great. So why is it emotionally intelligent? I feel so stupid asking this question based on what you just said, but why is it emotionally intelligent to do everything that you're talking about right now?
Well, this is one thing that struck me when I was studying social media, and when I wrote my book, Tell Everyone. I have a chapter there on businesses and how business can respond to social media. And we often talk about social media as a sort of broadcast medium. Let's pump out more information. But what struck me is the really valuable thing about social media, about the digital world we live in, is the ability to listen. So in Tell Everyone, I talk about how businesses can listen to their audience and actually respond to them, be connected to them in a way that you couldn't before, and connect to them in a very, very personal way. And I'll give you an anecdote from my time at the BBC. When I was an editor at the BBC News website, my boss, the editor-in-chief, wanted to experiment having reporters' emails on stories. So this is early 2000s. And he came to me with my team because he knew we liked trying new things. And at first, I was a little bit hesitant about putting my email address on a story, which is weird because you have a byline, but people can't get in touch with you. But we did it. And, what you find is you get some people who like the work you do and others who don't. And sometimes you get slightly more abusive responses. But what I found is by replying even to the ones who were a little bit less positive about your reporting, I remember replying to this person who was very negative, and I replied to them. And they replied back, and they were astonished that a human being had actually read this. They thought it was just going into this BBC machine and that nobody would ever read his email. So, of course, for him, he was like ranting at this abstract authority. But, of course, because I replied, because a human being replied, that completely changed his tone. And he said, I love the BBC. I love everything what you do. I'm your biggest fan. I didn't mean to be so rude. I didn't realize somebody was there. So what that told me very early on is with our audiences, with the public we serve, they want to be heard. That is what they want to do. They want to be heard. And we're seeing these translated into social movements like Black Lives Matter and Me Too. These are people who are saying, we don't just want to be heard, we demand to be heard. And they haven't been heard in the media because the media hasn't been listening. As journalists, we haven't done a good enough job at listening. And I think that's where the emotional intelligence comes in. Listen. There are lots of people who want to be heard. We have an opportunity to help them be heard. So let's listen.
I love that. And listening is so crucial. And just from a coaching perspective, when people say you need to listen more, People say, well, I heard what they said, but it's like, no, you've got to understand the subcontext. You've got to understand where they're coming from. You have to demonstrate empathy, what their challenges are, try and really understand their particular point of view. So listening is actually a very heavy, deep process, so that there can be that understanding, and then from that understanding, as I always say, and I wrote it in my book, from understanding comes growth, and that is absolutely crucial. So thank you for sharing that.
You're welcome.
So you're the guy that likes to do things. You've had a fantastic career. When John Lewis died, his legacy was just like imprinted into my heart, which is about creating good trouble, and that's how I got started with wanting to create this podcast. I've got to create some good trouble. I want people to understand that actually we're in an era where we're doing some good things. So let me ask you, what good trouble are you creating, Alfred?
I think it's funny when you ask me that question, because when you look back, I sort of look at my career, and very much I've tried to create good trouble by questioning things. So at the BBC, being attracted to projects where we could do new stuff, like starting with the BBC News website, even before that with BBC Election 97, which was a key election in the UK. And we're hand coding pages in HTML. We're asking for people's comments via email. In April 1997.
23 years ago.
23 years ago, already asking the audience, what should we cover? What is it you don't understand about this election?
Wonderful.
Really trying to think in terms of how we can do new stuff. And in some ways, I'm attracted to questioning the way things are done. And I think that's the good trouble I seek to do. Question, why are things the way they are? Why is it that in journalism, we always talk to police and politicians when it comes to protests, and report on protests as they're the other, they're the activists, the protests, they're not as legitimate as the police? Why do we frame coverage a certain way? Why do we talk about, say with police, about officer-involved shooting when it's, somebody was shot by an officer? Like, it's not an officer-involved shooting, it's somebody was killed by somebody who's serving the public. So really question everything. And I'd sort of encourage this with students. And one of the great things about being an educator is you learn from working with the students all the time, because they have different perspectives. They've grown up in this digital media ecosystem. We encourage them to sort of think about different ways of storytelling. I've had students who've, they've told stories with emojis. They've told stories through graphics. They've told stories in all sorts of different ways that it would never occur to me to do it that way, because I was, trained and informed by the BBC. I have very much BBC in my veins, so I have a certain way of thinking about this stuff. And with the students, it's saying, yes, this is where journalism has come from. This is the Anglo-American model of journalism. There's other media systems. This is some of its limitations, some of its flaws. But help me question what I'm saying. Question and think about how we can do a better job of serving the communities that we are there to serve. That, I think, is the good trouble. Questioning why are we doing things the way we do? Why are we doing this like this? That's a very simple question, but I think it's one we often don't ask ourselves, because we fall into habit, we fall into culture, and we're working within systems and institutions that then reward those habits and culture. And when we see other people getting promotions because they've done things the way the company has already done, then we think we should do that, rather than making good trouble and questioning why is that the way it is.
And often people are punished sometimes for asking those questions, because it may not fit with the groupthink, which just makes it look a lot easier. But for journalists, I completely agree. It's absolutely essential, because you're going to find the truth. But I just want to put that parallel into organizations as well, which is to question that and to feel that, like, there is an environment, or to create an environment of psychological safety where you can ask that. Because I think as journalists, you can. That's part of your mission. I just think about Superman, Clark Kent. You've got to ask those questions, to get to the truth. And really, I'd love to see that in the political landscape. I'd love to see that, where you can do that at home, where you're able to do that on when you're in safe ways, or when you're in your organization, or interviewing somebody. It's absolutely crucial. I think that we need to see more psychological safety to try to ask those very important questions. So thank you very much.
Well, just think how often you've heard we don't do things like that.
I know.
That's not the way we do things.
Yeah.
In some ways, that's the killer of independent thought. We don't do things like that. Well, why not? What's the issue? Is it just you just fall into habits? It's your own safety net. Are you protecting institutional interests that work to create systematic forms of power? It's in some ways it's a phrase that essentially kills off any independent thought and innovation.
Yes, I completely agree. So what parting thought or a piece of advice would you like to give journalists, people in media, and general people that can learn from your way of thinking?
Well, I think I recognize that I'm speaking from a position of privilege. I'm a white male. I have a career in the BBC. I'm a tenured professor at one of the leading universities in the world. So I acknowledge that I speak from a position of privilege and power. And it's hard if you're a young journalist coming out into a world of media where there's job cuts, where work is precarious, where it's a portfolio gig economy. I recognize all of that. But I would say there are also opportunities here in thinking through what is it you can contribute. And I think this is what I see encouraging, particularly with the students I teach and the ideas they come up with. They have incredible ideas that can lead to the regeneration of media, ways of thinking about media. But it's providing those supports. And those supports come from institutions. Canada's media policy is one that's going out to support the media, investing 600 million Canadian dollars, but it was informed by institutional media and is designed to support institutional media. Now, those are not the institutional structures we need to support a groundswell of independent media that serves the public. And I think that's the parting thought. This is not enough to say, yes, go out there and innovate, go out and do something. We need to challenge the systems of power that support entrenched institutional interests. And I'm very encouraged by movements that question issues of systematic racism, systematic gender discrimination. The fact the media uses the word systematic racism is a huge step forward because it acknowledges that we're living within structures that privilege certain individuals, certain people, and that disadvantage people of color, disadvantage indigenous communities, disadvantage women. So it's not enough to talk about these disadvantages, but to acknowledge that we're living within structures of power that sustain and reinforce those systematic systems of power.
That's wonderful. I don't want to finish there, though. People will find ways of expressing it in ways that may not advance the change that we would like to see in the world. Is there one tip, one special Dr. Alfred Hermida tip that you're able to provide that to help people say, okay, I can say it this way. I can talk about it this way. I can make that change with that will influence people in the right way.
It's interesting because this is the key thing. Often, when I'm working with the students, I recognize they're going to go into a newsroom and they're going to work with editors who may not be receptive to new ideas or different ways of thinking. So I always say to them, and I said to this just yesterday, think in terms of how can you make how's your suggestion, your pitch going to make the life of that editor easier? Like basically what's in it for them? How does this help them? Not just help you or help the community or because it's a great story or it's an underrepresented issue that you want to get coverage, but how does it reflect well on them and the institution? So in some ways you're appealing to self-interest. And so often we're all driven by self-interest. But in this case, getting somebody on side by saying, well, by allowing me to go and report this story, what we're doing is we're showing that our news organization is responsive to diverse communities, is representative of marginalized communities, is addressing issues that other media aren't. These are all positives that make you look good. So in some ways, think about if you're trying to affect change, this is not just about the change, but also bringing other people on board and persuading them that this is good for everybody. Yes. It's that, basically you want to raise all boats. In some ways, with the conversation Canada started with Marilyn Young, with that, the aim is to help academics write in a way that is more journalistic, have journalists working with academics so they can train and mentor them, but also bring more academic, rigorous-based journalism into the public realm, because everything is free to republish through Creative Commons. So it's like a win-win-win. Everybody wins through this. And I think that's the message I would leave people with. Think in terms of how the idea you're proposing, the story you're proposing, the shift, the pivot that you're proposing is a win-win-win for everybody involved.
Very well said. It's about packaging so you can influence.
Very much so. And often with these changes, yes, they may be difficult, they may be challenging, but there's a win across the board.
Exactly. And it's so important because some people just don't have that. I'm going to use the term emotional intelligence to be able to understand all of those different aspects that and perspectives that are needed. So they're able to make that very powerful influence. Otherwise, you're just shouting. You're shouting at it, and people aren't able to get it. You create barriers through that, and it's very hard to communicate with somebody in that particular way. So thank you for packaging.
Yeah, change is hard, but change is also an opportunity for personal growth. That's the other way to look at it.
Yeah, a lot of people are having to do a lot of personal growth, and nobody was invited to do this personal growth right now. Forced upon us. But
it's interesting because when you look back, sometimes the big change in particularly media has been because of external shocks. So the last external shock was the financial crash in 2008. Everybody expected that newspapers would be gentle decline in advertising. Along comes the crash, advertising falls off a cliff. So often there's these external forces that we cannot predict, that are outside our control. And I think that's the other thing to accept. It's like, accept that you can only control things that you can control, and there's certain things you can't control. So you can't control the world. You can't control how other people react. You can only control how you react and how you behave. And that's certainly one of my mantras. I can't control how people are going to react. I can control how I can react to them. And think in terms of understanding where they're coming from, why are they reacting this way, and how can we move beyond that to move to that win-win scenario.
So true. Alf, it's been a fantastic having you on the show. You've just provided so much wisdom to so many different areas of industry and organizations and individuals to be able to move forward, because it is a frustrating time, and your knowledge and advice has been fantastic. So thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you for the opportunity.